The moment Maria Slater set foot in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she understood that the world had a particular way of grinding down women who had nowhere left to go. She stepped off the stagecoach with a carpet bag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, the kind of letter that promises everything and delivers a cold dose of reality the moment you arrive somewhere that smells of horse dung and sawdust and sun-baked clay. The town was small, leaning against the edge of the Texas panhandle like a man who had been standing too long and was finally allowing himself to sag. There were 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office with a star nailed above the door that had gone rusty at the edges. Maria was 24 years old, brown-haired and dark-eyed, with hands that were already rough from years of honest labor and a spine that refused to curl no matter how hard life pressed down on it. She had come from San Antonio, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Her father, Thomas Slater, had died 3 months prior, leaving behind debts that swallowed the small boarding house where she had lived her entire life. The creditors had come first, then the sheriff's men, and by the time the dust settled on her father's affairs, Maria had $30, a carpet bag, and a letter from a man named Gerald Hutchins who claimed to be a land broker in Dusty Creek. The letter had been encouraging. Mr. Hutchins had written to her late father about a parcel of land east of town, 40 acres of grassland with a creek running through the southern edge, suitable for a small homestead or grazing operation. Her father had corresponded with him twice before his lungs gave out. The price was $150, payable in installments. Her father had believed it was a sound investment for his daughter's future, and so Maria had come to Dusty Creek to speak with Mr. Hutchins herself, to see if there was any arrangement that might be made for a woman of modest means and considerable determination. The stagecoach driver set her trunk on the ground and tipped his hat without looking at her, and she stood in the middle of the street, watching the vehicle roll away in a haze of yellow dust. She found Gerald Hutchins in the first saloon she tried, which she entered through the back door because the bartender had pointed her around with a look that suggested respectable women did not enter through the front. Hutchins was a red-faced man in a brown suit, and the moment he saw her, something shifted in his expression, something careful and calculating that she did not like at all. He told her over a corner table that the land had already been sold. He told her the letter she was holding was a misunderstanding. He told her that Thomas Slater had never put down a deposit, that there was no arrangement, and that he was sorry for her long trip. Maria looked at the man steadily, without tears, because she had learned long ago that tears only encouraged men like Gerald Hutchins to feel powerful. She thanked him with her mouth and walked back out into the sun, and then she stood in the street with her trunk at her feet and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She had $30. The stagecoach back to San Antonio would cost $12 one way, and she had nothing to return to in San Antonio. She could take a room at the Dusty Creek Hotel for $2 a week, which meant she had perhaps 15 weeks before she was entirely without resources. She needed work. She needed it quickly. She picked up her trunk and dragged it to the hotel and paid for 1 week in advance. The room was small and the window looked out over the alley, but the bed had a quilt that someone had made with care, and she pressed her hand against its stitched surface and breathed slowly until her heartbeat steadied. The next morning she put on her cleanest dress and went to the dry goods store, where a woman named Patsy Drummond ran the counter with brisk efficiency and a no-nonsense bun at the back of her neck. Maria introduced herself and asked if there was work to be had. Patsy looked her over in the frank way of a woman who had no time for pretense and told her that the general store needed someone to take inventory and manage correspondence, since Patsy's own reading was not what she wished it was. It was not much, $2 a week and noon meals, but it was something, and Maria took it with both hands. She had been in Dusty Creek for 8 days when she first saw Gideon Whitaker. He rode into town on a gray roan horse that moved with the easy authority of an animal that had been well-trained and well-loved. The man on its back was tall even in the saddle, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his brown coat, and a jaw that had gone unshaved for 3 or 4 days, giving him the look of someone who had been on the trail longer than he had planned. He wore plain clothes, nothing showy, no silver spurs or tooled leather, just a working man's gear, worn in the places where it mattered and sturdy where it counted. His hat was dark and pulled low enough to shade his eyes, but when he walked the horse past the front window of the dry goods store, he tilted his head back slightly to read the sign above the door, and Maria saw his face clearly. He was 31 years old, she would learn later, though he looked both younger and older than that depending on whether he was smiling or serious. Just then he was neither, just watchful and tired and a little trail-worn, and he tied his horse at the post outside and came through the door with the deliberate quiet of a man who measured his steps. He bought flour, salt, a tin of coffee, ammunition for a Winchester, and a spool of wire for fencing. He did not speak much beyond what was necessary, and Patsy served him with the familiarity of someone who knew the customer but did not know him well. When he handed over the money, he counted it twice, not from slowness but from habit, from the careful precision of a man who had learned to track every dollar. Maria was at the back table with a ledger when he came in, and she went on writing, but she noticed him the way you notice a change in the weather, without meaning to, just a shift in the atmosphere that demands acknowledgement. He noticed her too. She felt it rather than saw it, a brief pause in his movement as he waited for Patsy to wrap his goods. He did not say anything to her. He paid, nodded to Patsy, and left. She asked Patsy who he was. Patsy tied a knot in the brown paper around the flour and said, without particular emphasis, that his name was Gideon Whitaker and that he ran a cattle operation about 12 miles southeast of town, along the creek flats. He had been out here for 3 years, coming to Dusty Creek once every few weeks for supplies. He was unmarried. He was private. He worked his land with one hired hand named Oscar Torres, and he had a reputation for being straight-dealing and hard-working. He also, Patsy added, had been having trouble with a man named Harlan Cross. Maria asked what kind of trouble. Patsy said the kind that was becoming common in that part of Texas, where a man with money and ambition and no particular attachment to the law began to consolidate land by any means available. Harlan Cross ran the Cross brand operation to the north, 300 head of cattle, and a crew of men whose moral flexibility was well known. He wanted the creek-fed grasslands, and Gideon Whitaker owned a significant piece of them. She said all this in the same brisk tone she used when discussing which barrels needed restocking, and Maria filed it away in the part of her mind that tracked important information. She saw Gideon Whitaker again 4 days later, under circumstances that were less quiet and considerably more undignified. She was coming back from posting a letter at the small postal office 2 streets over, walking quickly because the afternoon sun was brutal, when she heard raised voices from the narrow gap between the hardware store and the cooper's workshop. She slowed without quite meaning to, and through the gap she saw 2 men, one of whom was Gideon Whitaker, and the other was a heavy-set man with a blonde mustache who was doing most of the talking. The blonde man was saying that Gideon ought to be reasonable, that a good price had been offered, that stubbornness was not a virtue in a man who was already overextended. Gideon's voice was lower, and Maria caught only part of his response, something about the land not being for sale at any price, and that the next time Cross's men were found at the south fence line, there would be consequences. The blonde man laughed and said something Maria could not hear, and then the blonde man walked away with his hands in his coat pockets and a smirk pulling at his face. Gideon stood alone for a moment, and Maria, who had not intended to be seen watching, stepped back a half-second too late. He turned, and his eyes found her immediately, and she felt heat rise to her face not from the sun, but from the awkwardness of being caught. She said good afternoon and kept walking. He said good afternoon back, and there was something in his voice that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but lived somewhere between the two. She made it to the end of the street before she allowed herself to exhale. The third encounter happened because of a mule. Maria had been asked by Patsy to take a delivery of ledger books and ink to a homesteader woman named Agnes Webb, who lived 4 miles out on the Eastern Road. Agnes Webb was 90 years old, apparently, and had been keeping her family's accounts since before the war, and Patsy supplied her with the materials every spring. The delivery arrangement involved a mule named Burden, who lived in a small pen behind the store and had a personality that Patsy described as complicated. Maria had grown up in a city. She had limited experience with mules in general and no experience at all with mules named Burden specifically. She loaded the saddlebags with more confidence than she possessed, led Burden out of the pen with studied calm, and climbed up in the manner she had observed other people climbing, and Burden immediately decided that this arrangement was unacceptable. He did not throw her. He was too dignified for that. He simply stopped moving entirely and planted all 4 feet with the absolute conviction of an animal that has made up its mind and cannot be reasoned with. Maria sat on the motionless mule in the middle of the road behind the store and spoke to him in a low, reasonable voice. She suggested they might try moving forward. Burden declined. She clicked her tongue and nudged with her heels. Burden breathed loudly through his nose. She tried leaning forward encouragingly. Burden took 2 steps backward and stopped again. She was engaged in this negotiation when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Gideon Whitaker riding past on his gray roan, heading out of town. He pulled up at the sight of her. He took in the situation with the quick, complete assessment of a man accustomed to reading circumstances at a glance, and she saw the exact moment he decided not to smile. She appreciated that considerably. He asked if she was having a difficulty, and she told him about the Agnes Webb delivery with the composure of a woman who had decided that dignity in absurd situations was its own reward. He dismounted, came over and spoke quietly to Burden, not to her, just to the mule in a low, unhurried voice, and ran one hand firmly down the animal's neck in a specific way. Burden's ears moved. Then, with a sort of resignation, the mule took several cooperative steps forward. Gideon told her that Burden responded well to pressure along the left side of the neck, and that the mule preferred to be told directly what was expected rather than persuaded. Maria looked at the obedient mule and then at Gideon and said that she would keep that in mind. He asked if she knew the road to the Webb homestead, and when she admitted she did not, he said he was heading east himself and could ride along as far as the fork, which would put her on the right path. She accepted because it was practical, not for any other reason, and they rode out of Dusty Creek together into the wide, open afternoon, the sky above them the specific shade of blue that existed only in Texas in May, so deep it seemed to have weight. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, which she found refreshing. He pointed out the fork when they reached it and told her Agnes Webb would be the second house on the right after the dry creek bed. She thanked him. He touched the brim of his hat and rode east, and she watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before turning Burden south. Agnes Webb turned out to be a small, leathery woman of considerable age and considerable opinion, who sat Maria down and fed her cornbread and buttermilk before she would accept the delivery, and who asked in the frank manner of the very old where Maria had come from and what her plans were. Maria told her honestly, leaving nothing out, because Agnes Webb had the kind of face that made dishonesty feel uncomfortable. Agnes listened, and then said that Dusty Creek was a hard place for a woman without land or family, but that it rewarded people who were willing to be patient and truthful. Maria rode back to town thinking about patience and truth, and also, against her better judgment, about gray roan horses and the particular quiet of a man who knew when not to speak. She had been in Dusty Creek for 3 weeks when Patsy told her, over the counter one morning, with the businesslike efficiency of someone delivering a weather report, that Gerald Hutchins had sold the East 40 acres, the very land her father had been in correspondence about, to Harlan Cross for a price that was considerably above its actual value. Maria set down the ledger pen very carefully. Patsy watched her and then said that it was a hard thing, and that Hutchins was not a man who deserved to sleep well. Maria thanked her and went back to the ledger and wrote very neat numbers in very straight columns until she felt steady again, and then she allowed herself to think about it properly. 40 acres with a creek, her father's idea of a future for her, gone to a man who already had more than he needed and who had obtained it in the way that men like Harlan Cross always obtain things, by finding someone like Gerald Hutchins and making the transaction worth his while. She was angry, quietly and completely, in the way she was angry about most things, privately and without performance. It was Gideon Whitaker who found her that evening. She had walked out past the edge of town, as she sometimes did when the hotel room felt too small, past the last fence line and into the open grass, where the sky went on forever in every direction, and the evening wind came off the flatland smelling of sage and warm earth. She was sitting on a flat rock near a dry wash, not crying, just existing very quietly in the open air, when she heard the horse. He came over the low rise on his gray roan, and she expected him to ride past, but he drew up when he saw her and sat in the saddle looking at her with the careful attention of a man who has found something he did not expect. He asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. He stayed in the saddle a moment and then dismounted and sat on the ground nearby, not close, not presumptuously close, but near enough that they were both in the same conversation, and he looked out at the same piece of sky she had been looking at. After a while she told him about the land. She did not plan to. It came out in the straightforward way things come out when you have been holding them quietly for too long and someone happens to be sitting within range. She told him about her father's letters, about Mr. Hutchins, about the sale to Cross. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that Harlan Cross had a way of acquiring things that were not quite his, and that Gerald Hutchins had been facilitating that habit for at least 2 years. She asked what could be done about it. He said, honestly, that he did not know. The law in Dusty Creek was Sheriff Dale Prout, who was not corrupt but was cautious, and cautious in ways that tended to benefit men like Harlan Cross simply through inaction. Maria looked at the darkening sky and said she had come here with almost nothing and had managed to make it less than nothing without even trying. Gideon Whitaker turned and looked at her then, and she looked back, and the last of the day's light was in both their faces. He said that she had not made it less than nothing. She was still here and still standing, and that was more than a lot of people managed. It was not a grand speech. It was not even particularly eloquent. But it was the truest thing anyone had said to her in months, and she felt it settle into her chest in a way that was unfamiliar and oddly comfortable. He rode back to his ranch and she walked back to town, and she thought about him much more than she intended to that night, lying in her small hotel room with the quilt pulled up and the window open to the spring air. The weeks that followed shaped themselves around work in small moments. Maria settled into the rhythm of the dry goods store. She learned which suppliers were reliable and which needed watching. She managed Patsy's correspondence with a neatness and efficiency that Patsy rewarded with $2 additional a month, which brought her wage to $4 a week, enough to save a little. Gideon came to town for supplies every 8 to 10 days, and each time he came, he spent a few minutes more than strictly necessary near the back table where Maria worked on the ledgers. It was never obvious and never inappropriate. He might ask about the price of fence wire or mention a problem he'd been having with a section of the north pasture, and she would look up from her work, and they would talk in the unhurried way of two people who have discovered they enjoy each other's thinking. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn terrain by walking it. He had come to Texas from Missouri in 1875 after his father's death. using a small inheritance to purchase the creek flat land that everyone else considered marginal but which he had identified, with the careful eye of a man who grew up near rivers, as exceptional grazing territory. He had worked the first year entirely alone, building the ranch house board by board from timber he hauled himself, sinking the fences post by post, sleeping in a canvas tent while the structure rose around him. Oscar Torres had come in the second year, a young man from a family whose own land had been taken under circumstances very similar to what Maria had experienced with Hutchins, and Gideon had offered him a fair wage and a share of the work, and they had become something between employer and partner in the way that the frontier sometimes created. He had a younger sister in Missouri named Clara who wrote him letters that he answered dutifully every month. He read more than most people suspected, keeping a small shelf of books in the ranch house that he read by lantern light in the evenings. He had opinions about land management and water rights and the coming railroad and the future of the Texas cattle trade, all of them carefully considered and clearly expressed. Maria told him things in return. About her father, who had been a gentle and somewhat impractical man who loved her dearly and had never quite managed to secure the life he intended for her. About growing up in San Antonio, the noise and color of it, the Mexican market district and the missions and the river that ran through it. About her mother who had died when Maria was 9 and whom she remembered in fragments, a particular laugh, the smell of rose water, the way she sang off-key without any embarrassment. She did not tell him how lonely she had been for a long time, or how much she had wanted the East 40 acres for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with belonging somewhere. She did not tell him those things yet. One afternoon in early July, Harlan Cross came into the dry goods store. He was not what she had expected. She had built him in her imagination as something crude and obvious, but the man who walked through the door was soft-spoken and well-dressed, with pale eyes that moved with quick intelligence and a manner that was almost courtly. He introduced himself to Patsy with charm and bought a length of good rope and a box of cigars, and when his eyes passed over Maria at the back table they were polite and unrevealing. He left without incident. Maria sat with her pen in her hand for a moment after and thought about what Gideon had said about men who acquired things, and she thought that the most dangerous kind of acquisition was done with manners. That same evening she went to the sheriff's office and spoke to Dale Prout, who was a lean, sand-colored man in his 50s with a lawman's habit of committing to nothing and observing everything. She told him about her father's correspondence with Hutchins and about the land sale. She had brought her father's letters. Prout read them carefully and returned them carefully and told her that the letters documented a discussion, not a contract, and that unless she had a signed purchase agreement, which she did not, there was no legal claim to pursue. She asked if there was any investigation into how Cross was acquiring his land. Prout said there were various questions being looked into. She left with the polite certainty that the questions would continue to be looked into indefinitely. August arrived with a heat that felt malicious, the kind of heat that settled into stone and wood and waited. Maria bought a wide-brimmed hat from the dry goods store and began wearing it everywhere, and Patsy told her she looked like she belonged in Texas, which Maria took as a high compliment. She had stopped thinking of her stay as temporary. She had stopped measuring it in weeks. Dusty Creek had begun to shape itself around her, the way places do when you stop fighting them, and she had begun to shape herself around it in return. She knew the names of most of the townspeople now. She knew which nights the men at the far saloon got loud and which nights they were quiet. She knew that Reverend Hooper at the crooked steepled church gave good sermons, and that his wife Edna made the best pie in the county and was proud of this fact in a way that was entirely earned. She also knew, with a clarity she had stopped trying to argue with, that she was falling in love with Gideon Whitaker. It had not happened in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, the way a fire doesn't start with the whole log burning, but with a small ember that gradually understands it is allowed to grow. The way he listened. The way he said her name, Maria, with a steadiness that made it sound like something worth saying. The way he had spoken to Burden the mule with more patience and tenderness than most men showed to people. The way he was honest even when it would have been easier not to be. She did not know what he felt for her, because he was a private man and he moved carefully, and she had too much pride to reach for something she was not sure was being offered. In September, the trouble with Harlan Cross took a harder shape. Two of Cross's riders came to Gideon's south fence line and cut a section of it, and 3 of his cattle wandered through and were found the next day in Cross's grazing territory, technically trespassing. Cross rode to town and filed a complaint with Sheriff Prout, and Prout, doing what the law required, fined Gideon for the trespass and warned him about fence maintenance. Gideon came to town to deal with it with his jaw set and his eyes flat, and Maria saw him from the store window riding up to the sheriff's office, and knew before anyone told her that something had happened. She brought him coffee that evening. She had made a habit of taking her supper at the small restaurant beside the hotel, and she brought an extra cup to the place on the front porch of the hotel where she had seen him sitting when she passed. It was a forward thing to do, and she knew it and did it anyway. He looked up when she approached, and the flatness in his eyes softened. He took the cup and thanked her, and she sat down beside him on the porch bench, and they watched the last of the September sun pull itself below the horizon, while the street of Dusty Creek went orange and then pink, and then the particular blue-gray of evening. He told her about the fence and the cattle and the fine, quietly and without excessive bitterness, though the bitterness was there underneath, the quiet kind that comes from watching deliberate injustice proceed methodically through legitimate channels. She listened, and then said that it seemed to her that Cross was building a case, detail by detail, to make Gideon's operation look unreliable in the eyes of the law, so that if, and when he made a more decisive move, there would be a record in Prout's office that told a story favorable to Cross. Gideon looked at her in the way he had when she said something that he had already thought but had not heard stated plainly before. He said she was right. She said then that they needed to counter it, not with confrontation but with documentation. That every boundary, every fence line, every water right should be formally recorded at the county seat, not just assumed. That every interaction with Cross or his men should be witnessed and written down. He was quiet for a while, looking at his coffee. Then he said she had a very clear way of seeing things. She said her father had taught her to read a balance sheet when she was 12, that a ledger had a particular logic that could be applied more widely than people supposed. He smiled then, the kind of smile that changed the whole arrangement of his face, and she felt it somewhere in her chest like a string being plucked. He did not leave for the ranch that evening as she expected. He stayed on the porch and they talked until the night came fully down, and the stars spread themselves over the panhandle sky in their extravagant abundance, the kind of sky that made you feel small in a way that was not frightening, but was actually a relief. He told her about Missouri and the river valleys there. She told him about the San Antonio missions in the evening light. He told her about the first winter on the ranch, alone in the half-built house with the snow coming through the gaps in the boards, and how he had decided that the cold was just a problem to be solved and not a reason to leave. She said she admired that, the ability to reframe difficulty as something solvable. He said he imagined she had that ability herself. She said she was working on it. When she finally rose to go inside, she realized they had been sitting there for more than 2 hours, and the town was almost entirely dark and quiet, and she felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the September air. He stood when she did because he was the kind of man who stood, and he thanked her for the coffee and for the company, and when he said her name, Maria, there was something in it that was different from before, something that carried weight. She went inside and stood in her small room and pressed both hands flat against the wall and breathed. She did not sleep well that night, but for the first time in a long time, it was not worry that kept her awake. October arrived with the first cool edges of autumn, and the grasslands around Dusty Creek turned from summer gold to a deeper, richer amber. Gideon had taken her advice about the documentation and had made the trip to the county seat at Amarillo to have his land deed and water rights formally registered with a precision that left no ambiguity. He had asked Maria to help him draft the letters requesting the formal registration, and she had spent an evening at the store after closing with the lantern lit and his papers spread on the table, working through the language carefully. Oscar Torres had come to town with him that day and been introduced to Maria with the frank respect of a man who valued directness, and he had shaken her hand and told her in his straightforward way that the boss had mentioned her more than once. Gideon had given Oscar a look that was perfectly neutral and entirely transparent, and Maria had managed not to smile only with great effort. She was also now conducting a very quiet investigation of her own. She had begun going through the county records that were kept in a secondary file at the dry goods store, because Patsy had been appointed as a secondary clerk for the county administration, a small and largely ceremonial role that nonetheless came with access to certain public documents. Maria read every land sale recorded in the county for the past 5 years with the same systematic attention she brought to the ledgers. What she found over the course of 3 evenings was a pattern: 6 land sales in the county, all within a 50-mile radius of Dusty Creek, all of which had been brokered by Gerald Hutchins, all of which had transferred land from smaller holders to Harlan Cross's holdings, or to nominees who later transferred to Cross. In 3 of the 6 cases, the original holders had left the county entirely within a year of the sale. The prices in 4 of the 6 cases were below the county assessor's estimated value. She wrote it all down in a single clean document, dated and cited, and put it in an envelope. She brought it to Gideon on a Tuesday afternoon when he came to town for supplies, taking him aside with a seriousness that made him put down his flour without being asked. He read it standing at the back table with the October light coming through the window, and she watched his expression go through several stages of something that was not quite surprise. He said that this was exactly the kind of documentation he had needed. She said she thought it might also be something worth taking to the U.S. Marshal's office, since it crossed enough county lines to become a federal matter of land fraud, and since Sheriff Prout seemed to be operating at the edge of his inclination to act. Gideon looked up from the papers and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, with a directness that made her heart do something involuntary, that he thought she was remarkable. She said she thought he was welcome. They both stood in the small, warm space behind the store counter with the papers between them, and the moment stretched, and she was very aware of how close they were, and how his hand was resting on the table near hers, and how neither of them moved. Then Patsy came in from the back with an armful of stock, and the moment dissolved, and Maria went back to the ledger and Gideon finished his supply order and paid, and when he left, he turned at the door and said he would be back in town on Saturday and asked if she might be free for supper. She said yes before she had fully processed the question. Saturday arrived with the deliberate slowness of a day that knows it is anticipated. Maria wore her better dress, the blue wool one, which she had carefully mended and pressed, and her wide-brimmed hat, and she met Gideon at the restaurant at 6 o'clock with the composure of a woman who had not changed her dress 3 times in the preceding hour. Supper was slow and long and easy. The way good conversation is when neither person is in a hurry to fill the silence. They talked about the land fraud documents and what might be done with them, and then they talked about things that had nothing to do with Harlan Cross at all, about books they had read and places they had been, and what they imagined for the future. Gideon said that what he wanted, above everything else, was to build the ranch into something that would last, not a cattle empire, nothing showy, but a self-sufficient operation on good land that could support a family for generations. The word family sat between them for a moment. Maria said she thought permanence was the most underrated quality a thing could have. He said he agreed completely. After supper, he walked her back to the hotel through the cool October evening, and at the door he stopped and looked at her with the particular attention he had of making her feel entirely seen, and he said quietly that he had been thinking about something for several months and was not entirely certain of the right approach. She waited. He said he was not a man given to indirection, and that he hoped she would tell him plainly if he had read things incorrectly, but that he had come to care for her in a way that was not casual. Her chest was very full of something she did not have an immediate name for. She said he had not read things incorrectly. He exhaled slowly, and she saw something in his face relax that she suspected had been held carefully taut for longer than this evening. He asked if she might consider allowing him to call on her formally, with the intention of seeing where the road went. She said she would consider it very much, yes. He smiled, that full smile that rearranged everything, and the October stars were very close and very bright above the quiet street, and she thought that Dusty Creek, for all its dust and difficulty, was perhaps the exactly right place to have ended up. He called on her formally through October and into November, with a respectfulness of manner that she found simultaneously endearing and somewhat frustrating, because she could see quite clearly that he wanted to kiss her, and was restraining himself with the careful precision of a man who has thought about the consequences of being hasty. She was not a patient woman by nature. She was practical and efficient, and had very little tolerance for unnecessary delay when the conclusion was already evident. On a Thursday evening in early November, they were walking out past the town edge in the dry, clear air, and he was in the middle of saying something about the south pasture grass quality when she turned and looked at him directly, and said that she thought they had been sufficiently careful, and that she would appreciate it if he stopped being quite so restrained. He stopped walking. He looked at her with something in his face that was half laughter and half an intensity that made her want to step back and forward simultaneously. Then he kissed her, not tentatively, not briefly, but with the certainty of a man who had made a decision and was fully committed to it, and she kissed him back with equal commitment, and the panhandle wind moved around them in the dark, and the stars overhead were genuinely excessive. They walked back to town hand in hand, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they did not need to. November deepened into a cold that came down from the north in earnest, and the town of Dusty Creek settled into its winter rhythms. Maria had saved nearly $30 by this point, between her wages and careful living, and she had written to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Worth with her land fraud documents, and received a letter in return indicating that the matter was under preliminary review. She felt the ground beginning to shift, slowly, in the right direction. She spent evenings at the store after closing, not always working, sometimes just reading by the lantern, and Gideon began to stay late in town on the nights he came for supplies, joining her at the small back table with his own reading or with the ranch papers he was working through, and they sat in companionable quiet in the warm store with the cold outside and the lantern between them, and it was one of the most domestically happy arrangements Maria had ever been part of. Oscar Torres came to town one December afternoon and found Gideon at the store, and told him in a low, urgent voice that one of Cross's men had been seen on the east boundary of the ranch, on foot, which meant he had come in quietly, and had been turned back by Oscar himself, and that the man had made remarks about how things were going to change in the new year. Gideon's jaw tightened. Maria, who was listening from the ledger table, said that the timing of the threat, just before the new year, suggested Cross was planning something specific and on a schedule. Gideon and Oscar both looked at her. She said that if Cross was going to make a move on the ranch, he would likely try to do it through some legal mechanism, given his pattern, and that they should have everything in absolute order before January. Gideon said she was right and asked what they needed. She listed it. The formal deed registration, which was already done, witnessed documentation of all boundary incidents, which Oscar confirmed he had been keeping at her previous suggestion, affidavits from any neighbors who had witnessed Cross's methods, and a line of communication to the county court in Amarillo that bypassed Prout entirely. Oscar looked at Gideon and said something in Spanish that she did not catch. Gideon did not translate it, but his expression did the work instead, something somewhere between pleased and self-conscious. She went back to her ledger. They brought her for Christmas to the ranch. She had not been prepared for it, how much she would feel arriving there. Gideon had offered the invitation with the careful casualness of a man managing his own hope, and she had accepted with equal care. And Oscar had driven into town to collect her in the wagon on Christmas morning, with a cheerfulness that suggested he was very glad to be doing it. The ranch house was modest but solid, built with the particular quality of attention of a person who intended it to stand for a long time. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft, a wide porch facing south where the winter sun came in warmly even in December, a stone fireplace that Oscar had built with river rocks from the creek, a kitchen that was functional and clean. On the mantelpiece, Gideon's small shelf of books, and beside it a photograph of a woman who must have been his mother, soft-eyed and patient-looking. Oscar had cooked, something with beans and dried chilies and salt pork that smelled extraordinary, and there was cornbread and a dried apple cake that he admitted took 2 attempts. They ate at the rough-hewn table, and the fireplace was generous and the light was warm and golden, and Maria looked around the small room at the 2 men, Gideon passing the bread, Oscar pouring coffee, and felt a fullness in her chest that she had not expected. After supper, Gideon showed her the south pasture from the porch. The winter grass was tawny and the creek was low but running, catching the afternoon light in small, quick flashes. He pointed out the landmarks, the cottonwood stand at the far south edge, the red-cut bank where the creek bent, the swell of the eastern hill that marked the property line. She said it was beautiful. He said he had thought so from the first day he saw it. He stood close beside her on the porch, his shoulder against hers, and she leaned very slightly into the warmth of him, and he did not move away. He said, quietly, not looking at her but at the land, that he had been thinking very carefully about the future. She waited, the way she had learned to wait for him, with the patience she had developed specifically for moments when he was making his way to something important. He said that he knew she had come to Dusty Creek because of land that had been taken from her, and that he understood what it meant to want a place of your own, not borrowed, and not temporary but truly yours. He said he had been thinking about that since she first told him on the flat rock near the dry wash in the spring. He said he had been thinking about it every time he looked at the east boundary of his property. She turned to look at him then. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document, worn at the edges from being handled more than once, and he held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a land deed. Formal and legal, stamped with the county seal of the Amarillo Land Office. 20 acres of grassland on the eastern boundary of his property, the 20 acres that ran along the creek's northern reach, with the red-cut bank visible from the porch. The name on the deed was not Gideon Whitaker. It was Maria Slater. She read it twice slowly, because her eyes had gone blurry in a way she had not anticipated, and the words arranged themselves with the absolute clarity of something that had been prepared with great care and great intention. He said he had filed it 2 months ago, in October, after their first formal supper. He said he had been thinking about it longer than that, but October was when he had been sure enough to act. He said 20 acres along the creek was good land for a small homestead, and that she had earned the right to a place of her own, and he wanted her to have it, free and clear, with no obligation attached to it except the one that was already there between them, which he hoped she felt as clearly as he did. He said he was not asking her to marry him with the land. He was giving her the land because he believed in her right to it, and then, separately and with the full understanding that she could say no, he was also asking her to marry him. Maria stood on the porch of the ranch house in the December light with the deed in her hands and her name written on it in careful ink, and she wept. Not from sadness, not from the grief of the land that had been taken, though that was there too, threaded through it. She wept because it was the most precise act of love she had ever witnessed, and it was directed at her, and the man beside her had carried it carefully for 2 months waiting for the right moment to hand it over. She cried with the unself-consciousness of a woman who has run out of reasons to protect herself, and he stood beside her quietly and let her, not trying to fix it or apologize for causing it, just present and steady in the way he was steadiest. When she had finished, she folded the deed carefully and held it against her chest and looked at him with her face wet and her eyes clear. She said yes to the marriage. He said thank you, which was not the expected response, but which she understood completely, because he meant it the way you mean thank you for something that you have hoped for with enough intensity that its arrival feels like grace. He kissed her then, and the December wind came off the creek flat, and the cottonwoods moved at the south edge of the property, and Oscar Torres, who had been very deliberately busy with something inside the house, managed to drop a pan loudly enough at exactly that moment to suggest he was listening to absolutely nothing at all. They were married in February, at the church with the crooked steeple, by Reverend Hooper, on a cold, bright morning when the panhandle light was the color of new silver. Patsy Drummond stood as witness on Maria's side, brisk and tearless and immensely pleased. Oscar Torres stood for Gideon, in a good coat he had clearly purchased for the occasion and carefully brushed. Edna Hooper had made a cake and was seated in the front pew with the cake on her lap, which was unconventional but entirely in character. Maria wore her blue wool dress with a length of cream ribbon at the collar and her wide-brimmed hat, which she had decorated with a spray of dried wildflowers that Agnes Webb had sent into town specifically for the purpose, along with a short note saying she expected to be told how it went. Gideon wore his best coat and had shaved that morning with a precision that suggested the occasion's significance. He stood at the altar with his hands loose at his sides and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that she caught from halfway down and did not look away from. The ceremony was short and unadorned and entirely sufficient. When Reverend Hooper pronounced them married and Gideon kissed her, the small congregation of perhaps 15 townspeople who had crowded in made enough noise for considerably more. And outside the church the morning light was brilliant, and the sky was the deep winter blue of the panhandle, and she thought with clear certainty that this was the beginning of the life she had been working toward without knowing its precise shape. 3 weeks after the wedding, the response from the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Worth arrived. The investigator assigned to the land fraud matter, a methodical man named Agent Calloway, had made preliminary inquiries and found sufficient cause to warrant a formal investigation into Gerald Hutchins and Harlan Cross for coordinated land fraud across 3 counties. The letter was addressed to Maria Whitaker, which required a moment of internal recalibration before she remembered that this was her name now. She brought the letter to Gideon immediately, and they read it together at the kitchen table of the ranch house, which was now also her house, and whose details she was still learning with the pleasure of acquiring new geography. Gideon said he thought it was time to also send Oscar to speak to the 2 families they knew had sold land to Cross under pressure, to see if they would provide statements. Maria agreed and also suggested writing to Agnes Webb, who had been in the county for 30 years and had seen much of its history and who had, as Maria had learned over several visits, a very specific memory and no patience for the glossing over of things that mattered. The investigation moved through the spring with the deliberate pace of federal processes, and Cross seemed to sense it because he became quieter, his riders less visible on the boundary lines, his public manner more careful. Gerald Hutchins left Dusty Creek entirely in March, quietly and without announcement, leaving behind the sign on his land broker's office and nothing else. Sheriff Prout came to Maria one April morning at the dry goods store, which she still worked at 3 days a week from preference rather than necessity, and told her in his careful way that he was aware she had been instrumental in bringing certain information to federal attention. She waited. He said he wanted her to know that he did not consider himself a corrupt man, just a limited one, and that he was glad someone had done what he had not been positioned to do. She said she appreciated him telling her. He nodded and left, and she thought that limited men acknowledging their limitations was perhaps the most honest thing available to them, and it was not nothing. In May of 1879, Agent Calloway came to Dusty Creek in person. He was a spare, gray-eyed man who wore his federal authority quietly, and who spent 2 weeks in the county taking statements, reviewing records, and speaking to a remarkable number of people including Oscar Torres, Agnes Webb, Patsy Drummond, and the 2 families who had sold under pressure, and who turned out to have been waiting for exactly this kind of approach with a readiness that suggested they had never stopped hoping for it. Harlan Cross was indicted on 3 counts of land fraud in June. Gerald Hutchins, who had been located in Abilene, was indicted on 2 counts and turned state's evidence, which implicated Cross more fully. The case would proceed through the federal courts and take the better part of a year to resolve, but the resolution was not in doubt. The East 40 acres that Cross had acquired from Hutchins, the 40 acres that had once been Thomas Slater's hoped-for investment in his daughter's future, were identified as part of the fraudulent acquisition scheme. The court proceedings moved slowly through the summer and fall, and Maria tracked them through the letters she exchanged with Agent Calloway with the same systematic attention she brought to ledgers. In October of 1879, a full year after Gideon had kissed her for the first time in the dark past the town's edge, the federal court issued its ruling. Harlan Cross was found guilty and fined substantially, with a portion of the fine allocated to the compensation of parties who had lost land through his scheme. Gerald Hutchins received a lighter penalty in exchange for his testimony and was barred from operating as a land broker in Texas permanently. The East 40 acres were ordered returned to the estate of Thomas Slater, which meant, as his sole heir, they transferred to Maria. She was in the kitchen of the ranch house when the letter arrived, standing over the bread she was making, and Gideon brought it in from where Oscar had brought it from town, and she read it with flour on her hands and the warm smell of bread in the air and the October light coming through the kitchen window. The 40 acres were hers. Her father's dream for her, which he had died before he could see come to pass, had found its way to her after all, by a longer and harder road than either of them had imagined. She sat down at the kitchen table and was very quiet for a moment. Gideon sat across from her and did not say anything, just let her have the moment in its entirety. Then she looked up at him and told him she wanted to build on it. A proper structure, simple but permanent, something that could be used as shelter when they were working the east pastures, or as a place for future hands if the operation grew. She wanted to plant it, not all 40 acres but a section of it, kitchen garden and perhaps a small orchard along the creek edge where the soil was deep. He said they could do all of that. She said she wanted to do something with it that her father would recognize as the thing he had imagined when he wrote those letters to Hutchins. A piece of land that supported a life, not a grand one but a real one. Gideon reached across the table and took her hand, the flour-covered one, and held it without caring about the mess. He said Thomas Slater sounded like a man who would be very pleased with how it had all turned out. She pressed her lips together for a moment and then nodded. They started on the East 40 in the spring of 1880, working it together with Oscar, and with 2 additional hands they hired that year, a pair of brothers named Thomas and Wade from a family in the next county over who came with good references and kept them. The creek edge land was exactly as rich as her father's correspondence had suggested, and the kitchen garden Maria planted in April was producing by July with a generosity that felt almost personal. She was also, by that spring, expecting their first child. She had told Gideon on a February evening, quietly and directly in the way she told him everything, and he had gone very still for a moment in the way he did when something moved him more than he was immediately able to express. And then he had pulled her close and held on with the particular strength of a man who is trying to make sure the moment is real. Oscar, when informed the next day, had expressed his joy with such enthusiasm that he nearly knocked over the coffee pot. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Maria approached as a professional situation requiring good management and adequate rest, neither of which she was particularly inclined toward, and both of which Gideon enforced with a gentle persistence that she found alternately endearing and maddening. She continued working at the store through the summer, reduced to 2 mornings a week by August, and she continued overseeing the East 40 garden plot from a distance that Gideon considered reasonable and she considered excessive. The child was born in October of 1880, a boy, healthy and loud and immediately opinionated. They named him Thomas James Whitaker, Thomas for her father and James for Gideon's father, and the two names together made something that felt like a bridge between what had been lost and what had been built. Thomas James was born with his father's dark hair and his mother's dark eyes, and an expression of general assessment that Oscar said made him look like he was already keeping the accounts. Gideon held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a large man handling something irreplaceable, and Maria watched from the bed where she had been firmly placed by Edna Hooper, who had come to help with the birth, and who ran the proceedings with the same authority she brought to pie-making. And she thought she had never seen anything as clearly right as the sight of Gideon Whitaker with Thomas James against his chest, and the October morning coming through the window of the ranch house that he had built board by board and intended to last. The following years built themselves with the patient accumulation of a life well constructed. Oscar Torres, who had been saving his wages with a discipline that surprised even Gideon, purchased a small parcel of land adjacent to the ranch's north boundary in 1881 and began building his own operation. He was 26 and had a serious manner and an enormous capability for work, and he had, over the course of the previous year, begun corresponding with a woman in El Paso named Catalina Reyes, and the correspondence had reached a point of seriousness that suggested it would resolve itself in the expected direction. It did. Oscar married Catalina in the spring of 1882, and the wedding was held at the ranch because the church in Dusty Creek had a crooked steeple, and Catalina had a straight-back dignity that seemed to deserve better architecture, though Reverend Hooper officiated regardless. Maria helped Catalina with the preparation, and discovered in her a sharp intelligence and a dry humor, and a talent for bread-making that surpassed even Maria's own, which she acknowledged without resentment and with genuine appreciation. Dusty Creek itself was changing. The railroad came through in 1881, a spur line that connected the town to the main Texas line at a junction 30 miles east. And with the railroad came new business and new families, and the particular energy of a place that has decided to grow. Patsy Drummond expanded the dry goods store considerably and hired 2 additional clerks and stopped needing Maria's ledger work, which freed Maria's time and also freed her from the slight awkwardness of still working for wages when the ranch was producing well enough that wages were no longer necessary. She did not miss the wages. She did not precisely miss the work in the ledger sense. But she missed the store's particular role as an information center, the hub of everything happening in the county. And so, she volunteered to serve on the new town commerce committee that formed to address the railroad's arrival, and the committee accepted her with the speed of people who recognized competence when it walked through the door. Gideon was quietly amused by this and also quietly proud, in the particular way he had of showing pride, which was to tell her she was right when she was right without adding any qualifications. Their daughter arrived in 1883, unexpected in timing if not in hope, and was born on a Thursday in March with a stubbornness that declared itself immediately in the way she arrived 3 weeks early and seemed entirely unconcerned about it. They named her Clara Louise, Clara for Gideon's sister in Missouri and Louise for no particular reason, except that it sat beautifully beside Clara, and Maria felt strongly about the sound of a name. Clara Louise was, from the beginning, a force of weather. Where Thomas James was measured and observant, his sister was immediate and loud and possessed of an absolutely irresistible laugh. Thomas James, who was 3 when she arrived, received her with a gravity that suggested he understood his responsibilities and had already begun calculating the logistics of them. Gideon's sister Clara came from Missouri to visit in the summer of 1883, arriving on the new railroad with 2 trunks and a very warm manner, and an immediate deep affection for her namesake that made everyone happy. She stayed 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks she and Maria built a friendship of such natural ease that it felt like something that had been waiting to be assembled, rather than something being constructed from new materials. Clara said on her last evening, sitting on the porch with Maria while Gideon and Thomas James did something with a fence post in the near pasture, that she had been worried about Gideon out here for years, the way you worry about someone capable who is working too hard and too alone, but that she was not worried anymore. Maria said she was glad of that. Clara said she thought Gideon had found something in Maria that he had not quite known he was looking for, and that it had made him more fully himself. Maria was quiet for a moment, and then said she thought it had worked similarly in both directions. Clara squeezed her hand, and then Thomas James came barreling across the yard, having escaped from the fence post project, followed at a dignified remove by Gideon, who reported that the fence post was fixed, and that their son had a promising future as a civil engineer or possibly as a general disruption. The ranch continued to grow in the measured way Gideon had always intended, not expanding rapidly but deepening, becoming more productive, more self-sufficient, better organized. By 1884, they were running 80 head of cattle on the combined acreage of the original ranch land and Maria's East 40, which had been formally integrated into the operation, while remaining deeded separately in her name. The kitchen garden had expanded to include the small creek-edge orchard she had imagined, 6 apple trees and 4 pear trees that were still young, but were gaining toward their first real production. She walked the east boundary some mornings in the early light while the children were still sleeping, the same morning light that had drawn her to the store window the first time she saw Gideon ride into town, and she stood at the creek edge and looked at the red cut bank and the cottonwoods, and thought about the distance between what she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek in 1878 and what she was now. She had been a woman with $30 and a carpet bag, and a letter that turned out to be worthless. She was now a woman with land, deeded in her name, earned by her own persistence, and the love of a man who understood that giving someone ground to stand on was the most honest form of devotion. She had children who called this place home. She had a husband who was, 6 years into their life together, still the person she most wanted to tell things to. She had an orchard that was learning to produce, and a creek that ran all year, and a ranch house that had been built by hand with the intention of lasting. On a May evening in 1885, 7 years to the month after Maria Slater had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek with her carpet bag and her father's feudal letter, she and Gideon sat on the porch in the late light. Thomas James was 5 and had been put to bed an hour ago after a day of tremendous adventure involving a discovered bird's nest, a questionable interaction with one of the chickens, and a philosophical disagreement with Oscar Torres about the proper way to stack kindling, which Thomas James had resolved by demonstrating his own method with great confidence and no accuracy. Clara Louise was 2 and had fallen asleep in Maria's arms during supper and been transferred to her small bed, with the delicate precision that parents of small children develop for exactly this operation. The evening was warm and the spring grass was green, and the creek in the south was making the small running sound it made in good water years, and the cottonwoods at the far edge were new-leafed and pale, and moving slightly in the last of the day's wind. Gideon had his arm around her, and she was leaning against him with her head at his shoulder in the way she had come to without thinking over the years, the particular ease of a person who has found the place where they fit. He said it quietly, not as a statement requiring response, but as something spoken aloud because the evening deserved it, that he was grateful. She understood precisely what he meant. Not grateful for any single thing, but for the accumulation, the improbable, difficulty-threaded, lost-seasoned accumulation of all of it that had resulted in this specific evening with this specific sky and these specific people sleeping inside. She said she was too. They sat in the quiet for a long time, the way they did when there was nothing they needed to say because everything important was already present and accounted for. And the stars came out over the panhandle one by one in the unhurried manner of things that have been at it a long time and know how to take their time. And the ranch settled into its night sounds, the horses in the pasture and the creek in the south, and the wind across the grassland that had no beginning and no edge. Maria thought about her father, who had written letters to a land broker in Dusty Creek because he believed his daughter deserved a place of her own. He had been right about that. He had only been wrong about the route by which she would arrive at it. The route had been harder than he intended and longer than either of them imagined, and it had moved through loss and difficulty, and the particular indignity of watching injustice operate through legitimate channels. And it had also moved through a Thursday morning in May when a man on a gray roan horse had ridden past a store window, and she had noticed the change in the weather without meaning to. She had her place. 40 acres along the creek in her own name, and the rest of it built and growing and permanent beside it. She had people she loved in it and people who loved her in it, and outside the window of the ranch house that Gideon had built board by board the apple trees along the creek edge were 2 years from their first real production, and the grass was good and the creek was running. It was, by any honest accounting, everything. Gideon pressed his lips to the top of her head in the quiet way of a man who does the most important things without announcement, and she put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and they watched the last of the western light pull itself down below the flat horizon of the Texas Panhandle. Inside the house, Thomas James slept with the total commitment of a 5-year-old who has had an extremely full day, and Clara Louise slept in the determined way she did everything, with both small fists clenched and a slight frown of concentration, as though even sleep was a project she was managing. The creek ran in the dark to the south, and the stars were unreasonably numerous overhead, and the spring air smelled of grass and water, and the particular clean smell of good land well kept, and Maria Slater Whitaker, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with $30 and a worthless letter, and the stubborn spine she had inherited from people who would have been very glad to see where it brought her, sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her and was, in the complete and irreducible sense of the word, home. The years that followed continued to right themselves with the steady hand of a life that had found its footing. In the fall of 1886, their third child arrived, a boy they named Joseph, healthy and good-tempered, who seemed from his first weeks to have inherited the best qualities of both his parents without the argumentative tendencies of either, which everyone found suspicious and also deeply charming. Thomas James received his new brother with the measured acceptance of a child who had processed the logistics in advance, and Clara Louise received him with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this development and intended to be thoroughly involved in it. Oscar and Catalina Torr's own family had grown by this time as well. They had 2 children of their own on the adjacent land, and the 2 properties had become something like a small community, sharing equipment and labor, and the particular knowledge that comes from working the same watershed over many years. The Torr's children and the Whitaker children grew up with the boundary between the properties as a thing that existed on paper and very little else, running freely between the two households in the way of children who have been given enough space to understand freedom, without being given so much that they lose the sense of home. The ranch operation reached 110 head of cattle in 1887, which Gideon noted in the ledger with the same careful hand he used for every entry, and which Maria celebrated with a supper that included the first genuine harvest from the creek-edge pear trees, roasted with salt pork and cornmeal in a way she had invented herself, and which Gideon ate 2 helpings of without being asked. The apples followed the next season, the first real apple harvest from the young orchard, and Maria picked them herself on an October morning with Thomas James beside her, and Clara Louise orbiting around them with the restless energy she brought to everything, and little Joseph strapped to Maria's back, because he refused to be put down for any extended period, and she had stopped arguing with him about it. She stood under the apple tree with the basket full and the creek sound in the background, and thought that her father would have known exactly what to do with an apple, that he would have eaten one standing right there, and said it was the best thing he had tasted. She ate one standing right there, and it was. In the spring of 1888, a decade after Maria Slater had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek with $30 and a carpet bag, and the absolutely unreasonable stubbornness that turned out to be the most valuable thing she owned, the town held its first formal anniversary celebration. The railroad had brought prosperity. The population had grown. There was a new schoolhouse and a new doctor's office, and the church had finally gotten its steeple straightened, which Edna Hooper considered a personal victory. The Commerce Committee, on which Maria had served for 7 years and now chaired, organized the celebration with the efficiency and warmth that Maria brought to all organizational matters. She stood on the steps of the general store, which Patsy had expanded into a proper mercantile, on the morning of the celebration, and looked out at the main street of Dusty Creek, which was dressed with bunting and full of people she knew by name and history, and thought about the woman who had stood in this same street a decade ago, trunk at her feet, trying to calculate how many weeks she had before the money ran out. Gideon came to stand beside her with Thomas James on his left and Clara Louise on his right, and Joseph had found Oscar's knee somewhere in the crowd, and was sitting on it with the comfortable presumption of a child who knows he is universally welcome. The morning was warm, and the street was loud with the particular happiness of a community that has decided to appreciate itself, and Gideon found her hand and held it without looking at her, just the easy certainty of a man who knows where the person he loves is standing. She squeezed his hand back. They had built something real here, the two of them, on land that had been fought for and documented and tended and earned. They had built it on the kind of love that was not spectacular in every individual moment, but was spectacular in its totality, in the way it showed up daily and completely, and without calculation. He had given her ground to stand on, literally and in every other sense, and she had given him a life that was larger and warmer than the one he could have built alone, and the accounting between them had always been perfectly even. Later that evening, when the celebration wound down and the children had been brought home and put to bed with the difficulty and eventual success of all such operations, Maria and Gideon walked out to the east boundary in the long spring evening light. They stood at the creek edge where the red cutbank rose above the water and the cottonwoods moved overhead, and the creek was high from spring snowmelt and running fast and cold. She had been here many times in the past decade, this specific spot, sometimes to work and sometimes just to stand, because she had discovered that the land had a way of settling her thoughts the way nothing else quite did. She stood with her husband in the evening and held the land deed in her memory, that folded document with her name in careful ink, and thought about all the versions of this place it had passed through before it arrived here. The version where it belonged to an abstraction called Cross Brand Holdings, the version where it was just a description in her father's hopeful letters, the version before that when it was simply grass and water with no human name attached. And now this version, which was hers and which would be, through Thomas James and Clara Louise and little Joseph, and whatever the future chose to add, a permanent piece of the family she had built on it. She told Gideon she had been thinking about expanding the orchard, another 6 trees along the South Creek edge, if the soil held up where she was considering, maybe 2 more apple varieties and 1 quince. He considered this seriously in the way he considered all land questions, with the full attention of a person who understood that these were not small decisions. He said he thought the south edge was worth testing before committing to 6 trees, that the creek bent there and the soil drainage would need checking. She said she had already tested it last week, and the drainage was satisfactory. He looked at her sideways with the expression she loved most, the one that was equal parts amusement and genuine appreciation. He said she might have mentioned she was testing it. She said she was mentioning it now. He shook his head in the way he did when she was right and he was catching up, and then he looked back at the creek and said that 6 trees sounded like a good start. She smiled at the water and he stood close beside her with his shoulder against hers, and the last of the evening light moved across the creek's surface in long gold bands, and the cottonwoods made their particular sound in the wind, a soft rushing that was the most peaceful sound she knew. The panhandle sky above them was going through its nightly performance, the colors shifting from blue to green to the deep orange and rose of a Texas spring sunset, extravagant and entirely unself-conscious in the way of things that have never been asked to be modest. Maria Whitaker, who had been Maria Slater, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with $30 and a backbone and the grief of a woman who had lost too much and been promised too little, stood on her own land with her husband beside her, and felt the absoluteness of an ending that was also entirely a beginning, because that was the nature of good land and good love, that they did not run out but only deepened with time and tending, putting down roots in every direction, reaching toward the light. The creek ran, the cottonwoods moved, the sky went on doing what it had always done. And the land, 40 acres along the red cut bank with her name written on the deed in careful ink, held them both in the easy and permanent way of something that had always been waiting to belong to exactly the right people, and had finally, after all the difficulty and distance and wrong roads and one very right stagecoach stop, arrived at precisely where it was supposed to be.